They want total control over your life, total control. The government apparatus is more powerful than the German Stasi, the Russian KGB, and the Nazi Gestapo. Just how much of your life can the government spy on? The shocking truth is almost all of it. And we're going to show you the unbridled power behind those government surveillance programs and what they could mean for America's future. This is one of the most important interviews we've ever had, and you don't want to miss a word of it.
Well, first in the news, the Ebola outbreak in Africa is by far the deadliest we've seen yet, but it may be even worse than the official reports say. Ephraim Graham has the story.
The Ebola outbreak has killed nearly 1,000 people in 4 West African countries. But a doctor working in the heart of the outbreak tells CBS News many cases are going unreported, and the disease is spinning out of control because it's difficult to contain in a sprawling, congested city center. The bodies of Ebola victims litter the streets in some areas.
This outbreak of Ebola is remarkable. The cases in this last couple weeks represents 1/3 of all the Ebola cases ever reported.
On record, there are now more than 1,700 active cases, including an elderly missionary priest who's been evacuated and returned home to Spain. And some infected people are refusing treatment in fear of being mistreated in a healthcare system that has one doctor for every 100,000 people. The Centers for Disease Control now has 24 staff members on the ground in West Africa. And at the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in Washington, President Obama called for even more health workers on the ground.
This is not an airborne disease. This is one that can be controlled and contained very effectively if we use the right protocols.
The Centers for Disease Control is now on its highest alert, a level 1. And the World Health Organization is considering whether to declare an international public health emergency. Meanwhile, Dr. Kent Brantley and Nancy Wright-Bowl, the 2 American Ebola patients, continue to receive treatment at a university hospital in Atlanta.
The key here is excellent nursing, frequent vital signs, fixing problems.
Ephraim Graham, CBN News.
Thanks, Ephraim. In other news, Israel's prime minister has a warning for the world. If you don't deal with terrorism, more innocent civilians will die. John Jessup has more on that story from Washington. Here's John.
Pat, that's right. Benjamin Netanyahu says the world must face down terrorists who are operating in civilian areas like cities or pay a terrible price. And he says a democracy like Israel cannot be blamed for defending itself against Hamas.
It stands before the international community with a wave of radical terrorists that are now seizing vast cities, civilian population, and doing exactly the tactic that Hamas is doing. That's exactly what ISIL is doing, what Hezbollah is doing, what Boko Haram is doing, what Hamas is doing is what Al-Qaeda is doing. And the test now is not merely the test for the international community's attitude towards Israel, an embattled democracy using legitimate means against these double war crimes of targeting civilians and hiding behind civilians. The test is for the civilized world itself, how it is able to defend itself.
Netanyahu says if the world does not hold Hamas accountable, it will lead to many more civilian casualties across the globe. Edward Snowden has been given permission to stay in Russia for 3 more years. Snowden blew the whistle on the National Security Agency's domestic surveillance programs last year, but he's not been granted political asylum, which would allow him to stay in Russia permanently. That decision will be made through a separate process. We'll have an in-depth interview on the NSA surveillance powers in a brief moment. Well, older folks who don't get enough vitamin D in their system could double the risk of developing dementia. A new study out of England finds people who had low levels of vitamin D were much more likely to have dementia or Alzheimer's. But researchers caution the study doesn't prove that low levels of vitamin D causes dementia. Still, they say the findings should send a warning signal to people who don't have enough vitamin D. And Pat, according to the CDC, about 1/3 of Americans don't get enough vitamin D.
It's so easy. The pills are so small, and you take a couple of them, and that's all you need. But the other
the
thing,
sun, too, you can get
the
it,
sun is where it comes from, but you have to be sure. I mean, if you're covered, smeared up with sunblock, it keeps you from cancer, but it also prevents vitamin D from doing its work. But that, you know, usually we're out working healthy, and, you know, you find an incidence of disease, for example, in the northern Midwest, you know, where they have very severe winters, and you have an instance of flu and cold and things because they don't have enough vitamin D. So it's very, very important.
But it can be supplemented.
Yeah.
The cheerleaders at a Southeast Texas high school are asking the state Supreme Court to rule on their Bible banners. The banners have Bible verses on them, and the cheerleaders display them at football games. The Kuntz School District had banned the displays, but later allowed them. But the district kept the right to restrict what was on those banners. The cheerleaders say the district doesn't have that right because it limits their constitutional right to free speech. Well, a floating restaurant in Kentucky is no more. Jeff Ruby's waterfront restaurant finally sank into the Ohio River on Tuesday. Ruby opened it back in 1996, serving famous people like Michael Jordan. Even Margaret Thatcher dined there. But in 2011, the restaurant came unmoored with about 200 customers and staff on board. After that, he shut it down to the public. But Tuesday, after apparently being hit by a few runaway barges and even a runaway iceberg, the waterfront literally went under. Ruby said it's sexy to dine on the river, but it's not safe sex. And you can always get the latest from CBN News by going to our website at cbnnews.com.